language of American Indian, various tribal peoples and cultures was beginning to be revived, and stories were being told by contemporary writers. It was not history. Sherman was able to also draw upon some of the aspects of his own generation. He was born on the reservation, the Spokane Reservation. He was actually born hydrocephalic, so he had various surgeries when he was young, and he was not expected to perhaps to live or to thrive. And as you see, if you come on Sunday night, he's a strapping former basketball player, and he's wicked smart. He learned how to read at the age of 3. His father taught him. He read Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath when he was 5. He says his early literary influences were Steinbeck, Faulkner, Hemingway, Emily Dickinson, Stephen King, and Walt Whitman. So he didn't really understand that there might be Indian literature until he got a little bit older. In his 20s, he decided he wanted to go off the reservation to high school. He was the only Indian there, except for the school mascot, and he became a star player on the basketball team. He wrote about that in the Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian many years later. He attended Gonzaga University. He gives the Jesuits some credit for his background. And then he went to Washington State in Pullman, where he was encouraged to write poetry. And he learned about the work of Adrian Lewis, Leslie Zilko, Joy Harjo, Simon Ortiz, and James Welch, which began him on a new path. And I think about, we're talking about the journey. So here's a young writer. He's getting into high school, he's getting into college, he's starting to write poetry, and he gets a poetry fellowship and starts sending stories, poems off to Hanging Loose Press in Brooklyn. These are the first gatekeepers writers come across, you know. Hey, Bob Rashad at Hanging Loose Press says, this kid's good. And he sends more stories. So Bob Rashad at Hanging Loose Press in Brooklyn publishes The Business of Fancy Dancing. So Sherman's life has changed. He's been published. He has a book. He continues to write. He writes a collection of stories. The Lone Ranger and Tonto, Fist Fight in Heaven. Now there's wit there. It isn't like the rage of the 60s. It isn't like the despair necessarily, but there's some humor there. He got the Quinn Hemingway Award. He writes, you know, a whole variety, all the way up till now. His writing is both gritty and colloquial and broad-ranging. He doesn't write only about the reservation. He writes primarily urban stories because he is an urban person, and 60% of American Indians now are living in cities. He also, you know, think about it, he's a poet. And he writes things like, you know, Bob Rashad just actually posted this last month, a poem by Sherman Alexie. It was one of his first. Now listen to him here, because this is different from what I read earlier, the comic part. Distances. I've watched the children of the third world starving on television. I've heard the stand-up comic ask, why didn't the cameraman give that kid a fucking sandwich? I know all the mothers of America have told their kids, clean up your plate, there are people starving in India. When I was young, living on the reservation, eating potatoes every day of my life, my mother would tell me, clean up your plate or your sister will get it. So there's the humor, but there's also some anger and some despair. This is his first poem to appear, by the way. And it was 20 years ago this spring. He was still a kid. It's funny, in the years since, Sherman Alexie's been very devoted to Hanging Loose Press. They just published a new book of his sixth, Face, and it's the bestseller of the past 10 years in small press distribution. Small presses have a big part to play in being gatekeepers and opening doors for some of the writers that we can talk about today, including Alexie. He's published all kinds of story collections and so forth. And you know, he's become a guy who goes on television on the Colbert Show. So Bob Hirschhorn said the other day, when Sherman went to make his second appearance on the Colbert Show, Donna Brooke, who was his wife, and Bob accompanied him both times. The producer came up with him, and she said, I remember you. You're Sherman's parents, aren't you? And they said, either we're looking more Indian, or Sherman's looking more Brooklyn, or her eyes were closed. He has a great, warm relationship with Bob and Donna, which I've heard them talk about. And if you go back and look for his poetry, you will find very interesting work from his early days, often drawing from the reservation experience. But I want to talk a little bit, I mentioned gatekeepers. Another gatekeeper, by the way, they're those who put people in the press, the small presses. Then there are those who judge awards and say, oh, by the way, you'll get the pen anyway or whatever. He was also named a grant to young writers. So these gatekeepers are sending him along so he gets more attention and more possibility of publishing more, of being listened to. He's very aware nowadays that he has a voice that few Indians have. Although he has pointed out that the growth of casinos has led to a growth of the people who consider themselves Indian. So we're up to almost 2.6 million in the country. He said, I have enormous cultural power now. It's all out of proportion to the number of books I actually sell. Because of my ethnicity and my age and the times we live on, I have power. But he says he has moments of being angry at the hypocrisy around him. Quote, the arrogance of this country is to have a Holocaust museum and point out the genocidal sins of another culture is amazing. The American General Philip Sheridan, who was the Colin Powell of his day, said, we should kill Indian children because nits make lice. And President Andrew Jackson said, let's kill the Indians. In any event, Alexie is very aware of his history. When I was preparing for today, I entered into a dialogue with him and asked him a variety of questions. And I'm going to comment and quote from him a little bit to just kind of whet your appetite for what he might say on Sunday, because I think he will be both serious and funny. I asked him, who are the gatekeepers now? Because he had gatekeepers, the small presses and so forth. He said, well, Native lit surge coincided with the Native Americans movements of the 60s and 70s, and they were interconnected. So there was a lot of political motivations, a lot of passion involved in creating art. And the Native American fight was to be seen simply as being human. It was a fight for one's soul. The political struggle isn't really about art or pride anymore. It's become an economic struggle. The Native American political struggle is about economic sovereignty. And I think great art will come out of a personal struggle, a struggle to find your soul, but how can great art come out of the fight to save a casino? So he has some issues about casinos. In the 90s and aughts, he says, lawyers have become more important to Indian life than artists. So perhaps with the collapse of casinos, the arts will rise again. He did say that there are a number of Native poets out there writing great stuff, and their influences are far more diverse. He says he was intensely devoted to older Native American poets, as he mentions, James Welch, Simon Ortiz, Leslie Norman Silko, Joy Harjo, Adrian Lewis. You can find heavy influence on him in his early work, he says. But in reading the young poets, he finds their work is influenced by a far wider range of non-native literary influences. So it's not simply looking to the older Indian American writer. Sometimes he says there's a Native American writer on the list, but it's a diverse group of poets that are being read by the young ones coming up behind Sherman. Here's the key: their influence, he said, by lyric and experimental work more that makes their own poetry less accessible than previous generations of Native poets. If you look at the Indian poets of my age and older, he says, you're going to find an intense narrative drive. We all told stories inside the poems, and story poems are going to get a bigger audience. But I think the wildly varied influences of today's young Indian poets is a great thing. I also think they're offering writing the kind of poetry that only other poets might read. As for the older generations, I think they may have stopped writing. I hope not. Is it because they can't get published? Or is it just because they aren't writing